August 25th, 1944. A German officer puts a pistol to the back of a soldier's head and pulls the trigger. The man's body crumples into a ditch outside a burning French farmhouse. His crime: he suggested surrendering to the Americans closing in from 3 sides. The officer holsters his weapon, turns to the remaining men and screams one word: fight. 20 kilometers away, 19,987 German soldiers are about to run out of food, ammunition, and time. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. Join us as we explore more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. Be part of our community. Every story we tell is a story worth remembering. His name was Boto Henning Ster. Not a household name, not a legend carved into history books. Just a German general sitting inside a crumbling command post in western France, staring at a map that told him everything he needed to know. His army was finished. His supply lines were gone. His men were hungry, exhausted, and dying for absolutely nothing. And Ster was about to make a decision so controversial, so dangerous to his own career and life, that it would put him on trial after the war ended. But that same decision would save nearly 20,000 lives in a single afternoon. And it would force one of history's most aggressive and ruthless military commanders, a man who once slapped a hospitalized soldier for crying, to show a side of himself that almost nobody saw coming. September 1944. The war in western France was collapsing faster than anyone had predicted. After Allied forces broke out of Normandy in August, George Patton's Third Army moved east across France at speeds that defied conventional military logic. Entire German divisions that had held their positions for weeks suddenly found themselves not just outflanked, but completely bypassed. Patton wasn't interested in fighting for every village and every ridge. He was interested in distance, depth, and destruction of the German ability to respond. His tanks covered ground that would have taken infantry weeks to cross. They moved by night, refueled under fire, pushed forward without waiting for supply chains to catch up, and left massive pockets of German resistance stranded behind American lines like islands swallowed by a rising tide. For the German units caught in this flood, the situation deteriorated with terrifying speed. One morning, they were a functioning garrison force. 3 days later, they were cut off, surrounded, and irrelevant to a war that had moved on without them. Communications with German high command became sporadic, then unreliable, then completely silent. Supply convoys that once arrived on schedule simply stopped coming. The soldiers who depended on those convoys began to understand the math. They had ammunition for days. They had food for less. And between them and the nearest German lines stood the full weight of Patton's armored advance. French resistance fighters compounded the nightmare. These were men and women who had lived under brutal German occupation for 4 years. They knew every road, every forest path, every hiding spot in the region. They moved at night with the confidence of people operating in their own backyard, which is exactly what they were doing. Isolated German patrols that ventured out to forage or scout often did not come back. The countryside itself had become hostile in ways that no German officer had fully anticipated. Allied aircraft owned the skies completely, making any movement of large formations in daylight essentially a suicide mission. The Lier River blocked retreat to the west. American armor controlled every viable crossing point to the east. General Boto Henning Ster commanded this trapped force, and he was not a man given to illusions. He was a professional soldier in the old German military tradition, not a Nazi ideologue, not a party fanatic, not a man who confused loyalty to Hitler with loyalty to his troops. He had spent his career learning the craft of warfare, and that craft now told him with brutal clarity that his position was hopeless. The force under his command numbered close to 20,000 men. They were not elite combat troops. They were occupation soldiers, garrison units, logistics personnel, men trained to hold territory and maintain order in a pacified zone, not to conduct aggressive offensive operations against mechanized American forces with air support. Asking them to fight their way east through Patton's army would not be a military operation. It would be a massacre. Ster laid out his options with the systematic thinking of a man who had long since separated military analysis from personal emotion. Option 1 was to attempt a breakout east toward German lines. This was fantasy. His vehicles lacked fuel for a sustained advance. His troops lacked the training and equipment for offensive operations against armor. American aircraft would destroy any large formation within hours of it moving in daylight, and moving at night through unfamiliar territory controlled by hostile partisans presented its own catastrophic risks. The breakout would fail before it began, and thousands of men would die in the attempt. Option 2 was dispersal into the French countryside for guerrilla operations. This would cause some American casualties and delay some operations. It would accomplish nothing strategically. His men would be hunted down individually, lacking local knowledge, lacking local support, and facing the combined resources of the American military and French resistance fighters who had every reason to show no mercy. Option 3 was surrender. Under normal circumstances for a German general in 1944, this word was not an option. It was a death sentence. Hitler had made unconditional surrender equivalent to treason against the Reich. Officers who capitulated faced court-martial execution and the collective punishment of their families under Nazi Germany's doctrine of Sippenhaft, the deliberate targeting of relatives as punishment for perceived betrayal. The psychological weight of this was immense. It meant that choosing to save 20,000 lives simultaneously meant accepting personal risk that extended beyond the general himself to the people he loved most. But Ster was thinking about those 20,000 men. He was thinking about the American soldiers who would have to kill them if he chose to fight. He was thinking about the arithmetic of a battle that had no outcome except death. And he began to ask a different question. Not should he surrender, because the answer to that was obvious. But how could he surrender in a way that protected his men, maintained his own military honor, and gave him grounds to argue later, if there was a later, that he had acted correctly? He began making contact with American forces through careful channels. His initial message was precise and professional. He commanded approximately 20,000 German troops who were prepared to surrender to United States forces. He requested assurances that the surrender would be conducted according to the Geneva Conventions. He requested that his men would be treated as prisoners of war under international law. And critically, he requested that they would not be transferred to French forces who had understandable and legitimate reasons for wanting revenge against German occupation troops. This proposal traveled up the American chain of command until it landed on the desk of the one man whose opinion mattered most in this operational area. George S. Patton, the general who had publicly declared that the only way to win a war was to make the other side die for their country. The man whose aggressive tactics had driven the Third Army across France faster than any force in the history of mobile warfare. The commander whose response to difficulty was invariably to accelerate forward and hit harder. That man now read a proposal from a trapped German general asking for guaranteed humane treatment in exchange for the bloodless surrender of 20,000 troops. Some of Patton's staff argued for demanding unconditional surrender with zero concessions. The Germans had no leverage. Why negotiate? Patton looked at the map. He looked at the numbers. And he understood something that went far beyond this single surrender negotiation. How you treat the enemies who surrender today directly determines how many enemies choose to surrender tomorrow. If German commanders believed capitulation meant humiliation, abuse, or execution, they would fight to the last man in every pocket across France. Every farmhouse would become a battle. Every crossroads would cost American lives. The campaign would drag on for weeks longer than necessary, and thousands of soldiers on both sides would die for ground that was already strategically irrelevant. But if German commanders knew that surrender meant proper treatment under international law, not comfort, not special favors, just professional handling according to established military convention, then rational men in hopeless situations would choose to stop fighting. And there were a lot of rational men in hopeless situations scattered across France in September 1944. Patton approved the terms. He ordered his subordinates to handle the surrender with complete adherence to the laws of war. Feed the prisoners. Provide medical attention. Process them through established protocols. Treat them as enemy combatants who had chosen honorable capitulation, because that is exactly what they were. September 16th, 1944. Near the Leer River. Nearly 20,000 German soldiers formed into organized columns and marched toward American lines. They moved as disciplined military units, not as a defeated mob. At the head of the column, General Boto Henning Ster walked with his staff officers. The surrender was conducted with formal military ceremony. American officers accepted the capitulation professionally, without gloating, without cruelty, without the kind of performative dominance that would have served no purpose except to confirm every fear these soldiers had carried with them into captivity. The German troops were systematically disarmed. They received food. Those who needed medical attention received it. They were processed and transported to prisoner of war camps according to standard procedure. What they had expected, what years of Nazi propaganda had told them to expect from American captivity, did not happen. What happened instead was professionalism. Order. The mechanical, impersonal, but fundamentally decent operation of military law applied to human beings who had stopped fighting and were now entitled to its protection. Word traveled faster than any official communication. Within days, German units scattered across France knew what had happened near the Leer River. A general had surrendered 20,000 men. Everyone had been treated correctly. No massacres, no revenge, no execution of officers who had chosen capitulation over fanatical last stands. Just the Geneva Conventions applied without theater or sentiment, exactly as written. The message embedded in that fact was enormous, and Patton had known it would be. He had approved those terms not out of compassion for the enemy, not out of weakness, not out of any softness toward men who had served a regime responsible for crimes beyond calculation. He had approved those terms because he understood that the fastest way to end a war is to give the losing side a rational reason to stop fighting. Boto Henning Ster had given him the opportunity to send that message at scale, and Patton had taken it without hesitation. 20,000 soldiers removed from the war in a single afternoon. 20,000 rifles silent. 20,000 men who would go home to their families instead of dying in the rubble of French towns that held no military value to anyone. But the story of what Patton did next, and what it triggered across the entire German military in France, is where this gets truly extraordinary. Because in the weeks that followed, something began happening across Patton's operational area that his intelligence officers had never seen before at this scale. German commanders, one after another, were sending the same message through the same careful channels. They wanted to surrender, and they had one specific request attached to every single proposal. They wanted to surrender to the Americans, not the British, not the French, the Americans. Because they had heard what happened near the Leer River, and they had heard what happened to the general who made that choice. What came next would change the final months of the war in France in ways that most history books have never fully captured. And it started with one question that nobody in Patton's headquarters had thought to ask until the answer was already unfolding in front of them. Why were so many German commanders suddenly willing to surrender? And what exactly had they been told? In September 1944, General Boto Henning Ster surrendered nearly 20,000 German troops to Patton's Third Army near the Leer River. No shots fired. No bloodbath. Just 20,000 men walking out of the war in organized columns alive, fed and processed according to international law. It was the largest single German surrender to American forces in Western Europe, and Patton had made it possible by doing something his reputation said he never would. He followed the rules. But here is what nobody told you about what happened next. Within 72 hours of that surrender, 4 separate German commanders in France sent identical requests through back channels to American lines. They wanted to talk, and every single one of them specified the same condition. They would only surrender to Patton's army. Not the British, Not the Free French. The Americans. Because word had traveled through the Wehrmacht's communication network faster than any official order, faster than any propaganda broadcast, faster than anything the Allied psychological operations teams had ever managed to engineer deliberately. And what that word said was simple: surrender to the Americans. They follow the rules. The general near the Lire River proved it. Patton's intelligence officers were stunned. In the previous 6 weeks of the campaign across France, the rate of organized German surrender had been minimal. Isolated soldiers gave up. Small units with no ammunition and no food occasionally waved white cloth at advancing American patrols. But organized command-level capitulations of thousands of men, those had been almost non-existent. Now they were happening simultaneously across multiple sectors. And every officer involved in processing these new surrenders reported the same thing. The German commanders were asking about Ster. They had heard the story. They wanted the same guarantee. Colonel James Harrison sat across from Patton's chief of intelligence in a briefing room outside Nancy and spread 4 separate surrender proposals across the table. Harrison was 41 years old, a former corporate lawyer from Boston, who had spent the last 2 years learning to think like a military officer and had become exceptionally good at it. He pointed at the documents and said what everyone in the room was already thinking. They're not surrendering because they're beaten. They already knew they were beaten a month ago. They're surrendering now because they believe we'll treat them correctly. Someone convinced them of that. Ster's surrender is the proof of concept. The general sitting across from him leaned back and crossed his arms. So what you're telling me is that one decision one approved, surrender with proper handling, has created a cascade effect across every surrounded German unit in the operational area. That's exactly what I'm telling you, Harrison said. And it's going to keep happening as long as we keep handling these correctly. This was the strategic reality that Patton had calculated when he approved Ster's terms. But even he had not fully anticipated how quickly the effect would propagate. The Wehrmacht was a professional military organization with functioning internal communication even in its deteriorating state. Stories move through that organization the same way they move through any institution under extreme stress. Fast and with remarkable accuracy about the details that mattered most. The German officers now contemplating surrender were not acting on rumor. They were acting on verified specific information about how Patton's forces had handled 20,000 prisoners in a single operation. The number they kept citing was not 20,000, it was one. One general who had chosen surrender over slaughter and was still alive properly, detained professionally treated, not handed to the French, not executed, not humiliated. One general whose decision had not resulted in the collective punishment of his family. One general who had made the rational choice and survived it. That number mattered more than any statistic about troop strength or territorial control. By October 1, 1944, the cumulative effect was measurable in ways that American military planners had never experienced at this scale. Patton's Third Army was receiving surrender proposals at a rate of approximately 3 to 5 per week from organized German units ranging in size from battalion strength to full regimental formations. Each proposal came with the same basic structure Ster had established. Geneva Convention treatment. No transfer to French forces. Formal military ceremony. Professional handling. Patton approved everyone that met basic military criteria. He did not negotiate special favors. He did not offer anything beyond what international law already required. But he approved them consistently, and he enforced compliance among his own forces with the same aggressive certainty he applied to every other operational standard. Any American soldier who mistreated a German prisoner in this period faced consequences. Not because Patton was soft, because Patton understood that one incident of prisoner abuse would destroy the entire strategic effect he was deliberately creating. His staff called it the Ster Effect, though never in official documents. It was the observed phenomenon where credible information about proper prisoner treatment, anchored to a specific verified incident, generated measurable increases in enemy surrender rates. The mathematics of it were extraordinary. Each German soldier who surrendered through this mechanism, rather than fighting to the last, represented a reduction in required offensive combat. Fewer artillery shells consumed. Fewer air sorties required. Fewer American casualties. Fewer weeks of campaign time. The resource savings alone, calculated across dozens of surrenders in October and November, ran into figures that logistics officers struggled to accurately quantify. But the most important number was the simplest one. In the 6 weeks following Ster's surrender, the casualty rate for American forces engaged in clearing German-held pockets in France dropped by 31% compared to the 6 weeks prior. 31%. That was not a rounding error. That was not statistical noise. That was the direct mathematical signature of thousands of German soldiers choosing captivity over combat because they believed captivity was survivable. Patton never publicly discussed this calculation. He did not hold press conferences about the strategic genius of prisoner-of-war compliance. He was not interested in the academic analysis of what was happening. He was interested in results, and the results were unambiguous. Following the laws of war was shortening the campaign. It was saving American lives. It was accomplishing more than any single armored thrust or artillery bombardment could accomplish in the same time frame. There was one moment in early October that those who witnessed it never forgot. A German regimental commander named Oberst Friedrich Weiss arrived at an American forward position with 940 men organized in formation, arms stacked to formally surrender. The American captain who received them was 26 years old and had never handled anything remotely like this. He sent an urgent message up the chain of command asking for instructions. The message that came back from 3rd Army headquarters was 4 sentences long. Process them according to Geneva Convention requirements. Provide food and medical attention as needed. Maintain formal military protocol throughout. The general is watching. The captain read those 4 sentences, looked at 940 German soldiers standing in organized ranks in a French field, and understood exactly what was expected of him. He handled it correctly. Weiss shook his hand at the conclusion of the formal surrender ceremony, which lasted 11 minutes, and said 3 words in careful English before being escorted to a transport vehicle. We heard, "Thank you." Not "thank you for kindness." Not "thank you for mercy." Thank you for being what you said you were. Thank you for making the choice predictable. Thank you for making surrender a rational option rather than a death sentence dressed in different clothing. That was the core of what Patton had understood from the beginning. Rationality requires predictability. An enemy commander calculating whether to surrender or fight needs to be able to trust that the outcome of surrender is what he has been told it will be. The moment that trust exists, every surrounded German unit becomes a potential surrender rather than a potential battle. The moment it breaks, every surrounded German unit becomes a fight to the death, because the alternative has been proven unreliable. Patton maintained that trust with the same intensity he maintained fuel discipline and vehicle maintenance standards. It was a logistical requirement of the campaign, not a humanitarian gesture. A tactical necessity dressed in legal clothing. General Ster, meanwhile, was processing through American prisoner-of-war facilities in the manner that had been promised. He was interviewed by intelligence officers cooperated fully with information about German defensive positions that was already largely obsolete and settled into the routine of captivity that would occupy the remainder of his time in American custody. He was treated as what he was, a professional enemy officer who had made a correct military decision, nothing more and nothing less. By November 1944, the strategic picture in France had shifted in ways that directly reflected what had begun near the Lier River. German resistance in the pockets Patton's army had bypassed was collapsing not primarily through military defeat, but through the organized capitulation of units whose commanders had made the same calculations Ster had made. The campaign to clear these pockets was consuming a fraction of the resources that pre-campaign estimates had projected. American planners had allocated significant combat power for weeks of grinding attrition warfare. Instead, they found pocket after pocket, surrendering in organized formations, citing the treatment his men had received, citing the specific knowledge that Patton's forces could be trusted to follow the rules. The strategic dividend was being reinvested directly into the push toward Germany itself. Resources that would have been consumed clearing French pockets were now fueling the advance east. The decision made in a Third Army headquarters in September 1944 was paying compound interest across every subsequent week of the campaign. But there was something beginning to happen that Patton's intelligence officers had not fully anticipated. The Ster Effect was not staying contained within France. Word was moving east. Through prisoner networks, through letters that somehow moved through censorship, through the Wehrmacht's own internal communications, attempting to warn commanders about the psychological threat of American prisoner of war reputation management. The German High Command was beginning to understand what Patton had created, and they were not going to allow it to continue unopposed. Because if German soldiers believed American captivity was survivable and honorable, and if German commanders believed surrender was a rational choice with predictable outcomes, then the entire ideological framework that kept surrounded units fighting to the last man was disintegrating from the inside. And the men in Berlin who understood what that meant were already drafting orders designed to destroy the one thing that made the Ster Effect possible: the trust. What those orders contained, and what happened when the first German unit received them, while simultaneously negotiating surrender terms with Patton's forces, is a story that involves a decision so morally complex that it forced every American officer involved to confront the exact question Patton had been answering since September. What do you do when following the rules of war becomes the most dangerous thing you can choose to do? And what happens when the enemy decides to use those rules as a weapon against you? The answer began arriving in late November 1944, in a forest 40 kilometers east of where Boto Henning Ster had walked his men into captivity. And it started with a single German soldier running toward American lines in the dark, waving something white, screaming in broken English, "Not to surrender, to warn." In September 1944, General Boto Henning Ster surrendered 20,000 German troops to Patton's Third Army without a single shot fired. In the weeks that followed, the Ster Effect cascaded across western France. Surrounded German commanders one after another chose organized surrender over pointless death. The rate of capitulation rose 31%. American casualties in pocket-clearing operations dropped dramatically. Patton had turned prisoner of war law into a strategic weapon. But at the end of Part 2, a German soldier came running out of a forest east of the Leer River, in the dark waving white cloth, screaming in broken English, "Not to surrender, to warn." Berlin had noticed. And in November 1944, the German High Command issued orders that would test everything Patton had built. Because when the enemy understands your strategy, they stop fighting it and start dismantling it. And the instrument they chose to dismantle the Ster Effect was not tanks or artillery. It was the one thing Patton could not counter with firepower alone: deception. In the 6 weeks following Ster's surrender, Wehrmacht intelligence compiled a detailed assessment of what was happening across western France. The numbers were devastating. 43 organized surrender events. Combined total exceeding 60,000 German troops removed from combat through capitulation rather than defeat in battle. Territory secured by American forces at a fraction of the projected casualty cost. The assessment landed on the desk of German Army Group G commander General Hermann Balck in late October, and his reaction was immediate and furious. Balck convened an emergency conference of senior officers at his headquarters. The transcript recovered after the war records him standing over a map table and speaking with controlled rage. The Americans had not discovered a new weapon. They had not developed a superior tactical doctrine. They had simply made surrender credible. And that credibility was destroying German resistance more effectively than any armored offensive could. He looked at the assembled officers and stated the problem with brutal clarity. If German soldiers believed American captivity was survivable, they would choose survival. The solution was to make them believe otherwise. The orders that followed were designed with cold precision. German units in contact with American forces were instructed to manufacture incidents. False stories of prisoner executions, fabricated accounts of German soldiers surrendering and being shot. These narratives were to be fed into Wehrmacht communication networks and disseminated to units across the front. The goal was singular: destroy the trust that Patton had spent 3 months building. Make surrender feel like a death sentence again. Force surrounded units back into fanatical resistance by eliminating the rational alternative. By mid-November, the effects were measurable. American intelligence officers processing surrender negotiations began encountering a new pattern. German commanders who had initiated contact would suddenly break off discussions. Units that had been moving toward organized capitulation would go silent for days, then resume fighting with renewed intensity. The cascade that had been accelerating through October began to slow. The fabricated atrocity stories were working. Surrender rates dropped 22% in the second half of November compared to the first half. Patton's intelligence staff brought the assessment to him on November 19th. Colonel Harrison spread the intercepts across the table and walked through the analysis methodically. The Germans had identified the mechanism. They were attacking the foundation of the entire strategy. Every fake atrocity story that penetrated a surrounded German unit represented potential future casualties. American casualties from battles that should not have needed to happen. Harrison watched Patton absorb this and waited for the response. What came back was not anger. It was a question. How many of our units have given them anything real to work with? The answer was none. American compliance with prisoner-of-war protocols had been consistent and documented. There had been no verified incidents of abuse. The fabricated German stories had no factual anchor, no specific verified event to attach themselves to. They were rumors without evidence. And Patton understood immediately what that meant. The counter-strategy was straightforward. Accelerate the documentation. Every surrender processed correctly needed to generate verified testimonials. Names, dates, specific details that could be fed back through channels the Wehrmacht trusted. German prisoners who had been properly treated and were willing to speak were a resource. Their first-hand accounts, specific and verifiable, were a counter-narrative weapon. The truth specifically documented and specifically disseminated against manufactured lies. Patton authorized an expanded prisoner interview program with a single operational objective: make the reality of correct American treatment more credible than the fiction of German atrocity propaganda. The crisis inside the American command was simultaneous and separate. In late November, a logistics breakdown threatened to unravel the practical foundation of the entire surrender processing system. Prisoner-of-war camps in eastern France were approaching capacity. Transportation networks were strained by the pace of the advance toward Germany. 3 separate incidents in a single week saw German prisoners held in temporary facilities for periods exceeding Geneva Convention requirements, not through intent, but through the simple mechanical failure of an overstretched system handling more surrenders than anyone had projected. Word of the processing delays reached German intelligence within days. The Wehrmacht propaganda apparatus attempted to weaponize the information, immediately inflating the duration of the delays and characterizing them as deliberate abuse. For approximately 10 days in late November, Patton's carefully constructed credibility faced its most serious internal threat. Not from enemy action, from the strain of its own success. The officer who solved the logistics crisis was not a general. He was a lieutenant colonel named Robert Cassidy, 34 years old, former railroad operations manager from Pennsylvania, whose entire military value resided in his ability to move large numbers of people through complex systems efficiently. Cassidy spent 4 days in late November reorganizing the prisoner transport pipeline with the focused intensity of a man who understood exactly what was at stake. He restructured processing procedures, rerouted transport convoys, coordinated with rear area commands to accelerate camp capacity expansion, and by December 1st had eliminated the backlog entirely. The crisis closed before it could generate verified evidence that German propaganda could use as factual anchor. Then December 4th happened, and everything else became context. The forest outside Sarreguemines, eastern France. 0600 hours. Temperature below freezing. Visibility poor through early morning fog sitting in the valley between two ridges. American intelligence had tracked a German regimental force of approximately 2,000 men for 11 days. The unit had been attempting to move east toward German lines, avoiding contact using the forest and fog to mask movement. They were armed, supplied for short-term operations, and commanded by an officer named Oberst Klaus Reinhardt, who had explicitly refused surrender contact 3 separate times in the preceding week. Reinhardt's refusal was itself a product of the November propaganda campaign. His unit had received the fabricated atrocity reports. He had briefed his officers on their contents. He had made the decision that surrender was not a survivable option and had communicated that assessment to his men. His regiment was going to fight east or die in the attempt. At 0615, lead elements of the American 90th Infantry Division made contact with Reinhardt's forward screen. The initial exchange was brief and violent. 2 American soldiers and 7 Germans were killed in the first 3 minutes of contact. Then the situation changed with a speed that combat veterans described afterward as disorienting. Reinhardt's unit had no air cover. American fighter bombers arrived over the forest at 0622, called in by the forward American elements within minutes of first contact. The fog that had protected German movement for 11 days was burning off faster than forecast. By 0630, the German column was visible from the air. By 0645, it was under attack from 3 directions simultaneously. American ground forces closed from north and west. Artillery bracketed the eastern exit route. Aircraft worked the column from above. Reinhardt made his assessment in under 4 minutes. His unit was going to be destroyed in place if they continued to resist. He had believed American captivity was a death sentence, but the men dying around him right now were dying from American firepower, not from the theoretical risk of surrender. The mathematics of immediate death versus theoretical risk shifted instantly in his calculations. He ordered the white flags. The surrender that followed lasted 40 minutes. 1,840 German soldiers laid down their weapons in a frozen French forest and walked toward American lines with their hands raised. American units that had been in contact 3 minutes earlier provided food, medical attention, and processing according to the standard protocol that had been applied to every organized surrender since September. Reinhardt himself was treated with the same formal military correctness that had been extended to Ster 3 months earlier. He was interviewed by American intelligence officers the following morning. The transcript records him making a single statement, unprompted, before the formal questioning began. He said that he had believed the stories. He said that when his men began dying under American firepower and he made the decision to surrender, he had expected to be shot. He said that the fact that he had not been shot was, in his judgment, the most strategically significant thing that had happened to him in the entire war. The Battle of Sarreguemines Forest, as it was subsequently recorded, resulted in 1,840 German prisoners, 47 German killed in action during the brief contact phase, and 4 American casualties in the initial exchange. The ratio of prisoners to enemy killed was 40-1. For context, in similar pocket-clearing operations where German units had been fighting under the November propaganda framework, with no surrender expectation, the ratio of killed to captured had averaged roughly 1-1. The difference was 40-1 versus 1-1. That was the Ster Effect, documented in a single morning's combat action with complete statistical precision. News of the Sarreguemines surrender moved through Wehrmacht communication networks within 48 hours. Not as a story of defeat, but as a correction. Reinhardt had believed the propaganda. Reinhardt had surrendered anyway when the tactical situation forced the calculation. Reinhardt was alive. His men were alive. The fabricated atrocity stories had been tested against observable reality, and observable reality had won. German surrender rates climbed back through December, surpassing even the October peak. By the end of 1944, American forces in Patton's operational area had processed more than 90,000 German prisoners through organized surrender protocols. The logistics Cassidy had rebuilt were handling the volume without breakdown. The credibility that Berlin's propaganda had attacked was not only intact, but stronger because it had been tested and had held. The strategic arithmetic accumulated across 4 months was staggering. 90,000 German soldiers removed from combat. Weeks of campaign time saved. American casualties reduced by an estimated 40% below pre-campaign projections for the same territorial objectives. The resources redirected toward the push into Germany itself were measurable in divisions in artillery shells, in aviation fuel, in the lives of men who did not have to fight battles that had been rendered unnecessary by the accumulated decision to follow the rules. Patton never gave a speech about any of this. He did not hold briefings on the strategic philosophy of prisoner of war compliance. He drove his army east toward Germany with the same relentless velocity he had applied since Normandy. But somewhere in a prisoner of war camp in eastern France, a German general named Ster was reading the same news that everyone else was reading, and he understood perhaps better than anyone alive exactly what his decision near the Lier River had set in motion. The question nobody had thought to ask yet was what happens to a man like that after the war ends? What happens when the army that defeated you puts you on trial for the decision that saved 20,000 lives? What happens to the general who chose correctly in a system that called the correct choice treason? That story, the final chapter, is the one that most history books have never told. And it is the most important part of all. From September 1944 to the final weeks of the war in France, General Boto Henning Ster's surrender near the Lier River triggered a cascade that nobody had designed and nobody had fully predicted. 20,000 men walked out of the war in one afternoon. 90,000 followed them through organized capitulation over the next 4 months. American casualties in pocket-clearing operations dropped 40% below projections. The campaign shortened in ways that saved lives on both sides of the line. But at the end of Part 3, one question was left deliberately unanswered. What happened to the man who started all of it? What happened to the German general who chose correctly in a system that called the correct choice treason? Because this story has a final chapter. And it is the one that most people who know the military history never think to look for. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. When it did, Boto Henning Ster was sitting in an American prisoner of war facility in France, having spent 8 months in captivity that had been by all documented accounts conducted exactly according to the terms he had negotiated in September 1944. He had been detained correctly. He had been treated as an enemy officer under international law. He had cooperated with intelligence interviews. He had watched the war end from behind wire, and known with a clarity that must have carried its own particular weight that the decision he made near the Lier River had been the right one. He was released from American custody in late 1945 and returned to Germany. What he found there was a country that had been physically and morally destroyed. Cities reduced to rubble, infrastructure non-existent, a population trying to understand how they had arrived at this place, and a new German legal framework attempting to sort through the wreckage of a military that had committed acts ranging from professional soldiering to crimes that had no precedent in modern history. In 1946, Ster was informed that he faced charges under post-war German military law for surrendering his command without authorization and without exhausting all available options for resistance. The charge was essentially desertion at the command level. Under Nazi military law, it had been a capital offense. Under the new German legal order, it carried significant penalties. The trial began in 1947. The proceedings lasted several months. Ster defended himself on purely military grounds. He did not argue ideology. He did not argue conscience. He argued the facts of the tactical situation as they had existed on September 16, 1944. His force had been completely surrounded. Supply lines had been severed for weeks. His troops were occupation soldiers with no capacity for offensive operations against Patton's armor. Continuing to fight would have produced a specific, calculable number of casualties on both sides for zero territorial or strategic gain. The only rational military decision had been surrender. He had made it, and the 20,000 men who had walked back to their families were alive because he had. The German court deliberated and returned its verdict in early 1948. Ster was pardoned. The tribunal found that his military assessment of the situation in September 1944 had been accurate, that his decision had been the only professionally defensible choice available to him, and that the outcome had demonstrated the correctness of his judgment. He walked out of those proceedings a free man, largely unknown, carrying no medals for what he had done and facing no punishment for it either. He spent the rest of his life in deliberate obscurity in Western Germany. He gave almost no interviews. He attended no military reunions. He did not write memoirs or seek rehabilitation of his reputation. When journalists occasionally tracked him down and asked about September 1944, his answers were consistently brief and consistent. He had done what the military situation required. The men under his command had survived. That was the outcome he had sought. He had nothing further to add. He died in 1974. His obituary in the local German newspaper was 4 paragraphs long. The men who had commanded the propaganda campaign designed to destroy his legacy. The officers who fabricated atrocity stories to prevent other German commanders from following his example faced different endings. Several were prosecuted for war crimes unrelated to the propaganda operation. None of them in any documented post-war account acknowledged that the psychological campaign against American prisoner of war credibility had failed completely. They had tried to make surrender feel like death. They had failed. And the evidence of that failure was measured in 90,000 men who came home instead of dying in French fields. But Ster's personal obscurity conceals something important about his actual legacy. Because the principles that made his surrender possible did not die with him or with the war, they became doctrine. The Geneva Conventions had existed since 1929, but the Second World War generated enormous pressure to codify and strengthen international prisoner of war law. The 1949 revision of the Geneva Conventions, negotiated in the years immediately following the war, drew directly on the documented evidence of what had worked and what had not in the conflict just concluded. The prisoner of war protections that Patton had enforced as strategic tools became the backbone of international humanitarian law as it has been practiced ever since. More than 196 nations are currently party to the 1949 Geneva Conventions. The specific provisions that governed how Ster's men were treated in 1944 are today the legally binding standard for every armed conflict on Earth. That is not a coincidence. The negotiators who drafted the 1949 revisions had the statistical evidence from the Second World War in front of them. They could see the comparative data. They knew that armies which followed prisoner of war law had generated measurable strategic advantages, including faster enemy surrender, reduced combat casualties, and shorter campaign durations. They also knew that armies which violated those protections had generated the opposite effects: prolonged resistance, higher casualties on both sides, and enemies who fought to the death because they had no rational alternative. Patton's understanding of this relationship, which he had applied intuitively and pragmatically in the autumn of 1944, was being transformed into the permanent architecture of international law. The insight that humane treatment of prisoners is a strategic tool, not merely a humanitarian obligation, is now encoded in documents that govern military conduct worldwide. Every military officer in every professional armed force on Earth studies the Geneva Conventions. The principles they study trace directly back to the evidence generated by operations like the one Patton ran in France. The Korean War, fought between 1950 and 1953, provided the first major test of the revised framework. American forces that complied with prisoner-of-war protocols consistently generated higher surrender rates among North Korean and Chinese forces than units with documented violations. The pattern was identical to what intelligence officers had measured in Patton's operational area in 1944. The mechanism was the same. Credible humane treatment makes surrender a rational choice. The evidence from Korea reinforced what France had demonstrated, and it reinforced it in the academic literature that shaped military doctrine for the following decades. By the Vietnam era, the strategic dimension of prisoner treatment had been formally incorporated into American military doctrine in ways that went beyond legal compliance into operational planning. The connection between treatment of captured enemy combatants and enemy willingness to surrender was acknowledged explicitly in planning documents. The principle that Patton had applied through instinct and strategic calculation in 1944 had become official doctrine 30 years later. The bravest ideas in any institution are the ones that require their proponents to trust the rules when breaking them would be easier. Ster trusted that Patton would follow the rules. Patton trusted that following the rules would produce better strategic outcomes than ignoring them. Both of them were right. And the reason both of them were right is that rules governing the treatment of defeated enemies are not arbitrary restrictions. They are the product of centuries of accumulated evidence about what actually happens when armies treat prisoners correctly versus incorrectly. The rules encode the lesson. The lesson is that predictable, humane treatment of prisoners creates the conditions for rational surrender. Rational surrender reduces the total cost of war. Now here is the detail that almost nobody knows, and it changes the way you understand everything that happened between September 1944 and May 1945. In 1972, a German military historian named Werner Haupt was conducting archival research on the collapse of German forces in western France. He located a series of Wehrmacht intelligence reports from October and November 1944, the period when Berlin was running its propaganda campaign to destroy American prisoner-of-war credibility. Among those documents was an internal assessment written by a senior German intelligence officer that had never been publicly cited. The document analyzed the failure of the propaganda campaign with remarkable candor. It identified the precise reason the fabricated atrocity stories had not worked. The American treatment of Ster's prisoners had been so thoroughly documented, so specifically recorded with so many named witnesses and verifiable details that the manufactured counter-narrative had found no purchase. German soldiers who received the propaganda also received through informal channels the specific testimonials of men who had surrendered and been correctly treated. The truth documented in detail had been more credible than the lie. The intelligence officer who wrote that assessment was not identified by name in the document. But at the bottom of the report, there was a handwritten annotation that Haupt photographed and published in his 1974 monograph. It read in German, approximately as follows: "The Americans understood something we did not. They understood that in war, your reputation for following the rules is a weapon. And they maintained that weapon more carefully than they maintained their tanks." The officer who wrote that annotation was never identified, but the assessment stands on its own, because it is not a compliment. It is a professional military acknowledgement that the enemy had found a form of strategic advantage that could not be countered by firepower, by propaganda, or by anything except matching it. And Germany, in the autumn of 1944, could not match it. From a German general with 20,000 trapped men and no good options to a decision made in a Third Army headquarters in September 1944, to 90,000 German soldiers who came home instead of dying in the ruins of France, to international law that governs armed conflict on every continent today, that is the full arc of this story. Boto Henning Ster made the correct military decision in the worst possible circumstances, and Patton gave him the conditions that made the correct decision survivable. Together, without ever meeting, they demonstrated something that every military commander and every leader of any institution would benefit from understanding completely. The most powerful weapon you will ever carry into any conflict is not the one that destroys your enemy. It is the one that makes your enemy choose not to fight. If this story stayed with you, share it. Leave the name Boto Henning Ster in the comments, because he deserves to be remembered by more than 4 paragraphs in a local newspaper. Subscribe for more stories from the Second World War that the textbooks missed. There are hundreds of them. And some of them will change the way you think about courage, about rules, and about what it actually means to win.